Imagine turning on your computer in 2026 and realizing that the idea of booting into Windows feels strangely outdated, almost like remembering dial-up internet or floppy disks. The shift doesn't happen overnight, with a dramatic announcement or a single killer feature, but through a steady accumulation of small, practical advantages that quietly change how people use their machines. This is where one particular Linux distribution enters the picture, not as a niche operating system for developers or privacy enthusiasts, but as a polished, mainstream platform that challenges Windows on its own turf. What makes this Linux distro different is not that it reinvents computing, but that it finally removes the friction that once kept Linux from everyday users, while simultaneously solving problems Windows users have grown tired of tolerating. For decades, Windows dominated the desktop because it was familiar, compatible, and supported by an enormous ecosystem of software and hardware vendors. Linux, despite its power and flexibility, was seen as fragmented, complicated, and unfriendly to newcomers. That reputation stuck even as Linux quietly took over servers, supercomputers, smartphones, through Android, and much of the cloud infrastructure. The irony has always been that the most critical systems in the world already run on Linux, yet the average home or office desktop remained tied to Windows. The Linux distro that could make Windows obsolete by 2026 changes this dynamic by focusing relentlessly on user experience without sacrificing the core Linux principles of freedom, security, and control. At the heart of this transformation is a design philosophy that treats the desktop as a complete, cohesive product, rather than a collection of loosely connected components. Installation is no longer a technical ritual that intimidates first-time users. Instead, it feels as simple and reassuring as setting up a smartphone or a modern laptop. Hardware detection works seamlessly, Wi-Fi connects instantly, printers are discovered automatically, and common peripherals function without manual configuration. This might sound trivial, but it addresses one of the biggest historical barriers to Linux adoption. When people install an operating system, they expect it to work immediately. This distro understands that expectation and meets it consistently. Performance is another area where the gap between Windows and Linux has not just closed, but reversed. Modern versions of Windows carry a heavy load of background services, telemetry processes, and legacy components designed to maintain compatibility with decades of software. Over time, this complexity takes a toll, especially on mid-range or older hardware. The Linux distro in question is built with efficiency as a priority. It boots faster, uses less memory, and remains responsive even under load. On machines that feel sluggish under Windows 11, this distro feels refreshingly light, extending the useful life of hardware that might otherwise be replaced. In a world increasingly conscious of cost and environmental impact, that alone is a powerful argument. Security plays an even bigger role in why this Linux distro could render Windows obsolete. Windows has always been a prime target for malware, not because it is inherently poorly designed, but because of its massive user base and deep integration of third-party software. Antivirus tools, firewalls, and constant updates have become a fact of life for Windows users. Yet security incidents remain common. Linux approaches security differently, with a permission model that isolates applications, a software distribution system that relies on trusted repositories, and a culture that treats security as a default rather than an add-on. This distro builds on that foundation with sandboxed applications, mandatory access controls, and system updates that don't interrupt work or force reboots at inconvenient times. For users, this translates into peace of mind rather than constant vigilance. Privacy is another area where the contrast between Windows and this Linux distro is stark. Modern Windows versions collect significant amounts of usage data, much of it enabled by default. While Microsoft argues that this telemetry improves the product, many users are uncomfortable with how much information leaves their machines. The Linux distro takes the opposite approach. It collects little to no data by default, is transparent about what it does collect, and allows users to opt in rather than opt out. This transparency builds trust, especially among individuals and organizations increasingly concerned about data sovereignty and digital rights. Software compatibility, once Linux's greatest weakness, has become one of its strongest advantages. Traditional Linux distributions struggled because many popular applications were available only for Windows or Mac OS. That gap has narrowed dramatically. Open source alternatives have matured, and cross-platform frameworks mean many commercial applications now run natively on Linux. On top of that, compatibility layers allow Windows software to run with surprising reliability. For the average user, the question is no longer can I do my work on Linux, but why wouldn't I? This distro simplifies access to all of this by offering a unified app store that combines native applications, sandboxed packages, and compatibility tools in a way that feels effortless. Gaming, long considered a Windows-only domain, is another area where the landscape has changed dramatically, thanks to advances in graphics, drivers, and compatibility technology. Thousands of Windows games now run smoothly on Linux. The distro integrates these tools out of the box, making gaming on Linux less of an experiment and more of a mainstream option. Performance is often comparable to Windows, and in some cases, even better due to lower system overhead. For gamers who once had no choice but Windows, this represents a significant shift in perception. The desktop environment itself deserves special attention, rather than forcing users to adapt to a radically different workflow. This Linux distro offers an interface that feels immediately familiar while remaining customizable. Users can choose layouts that resemble traditional desktops, modern touch-friendly designs, or something entirely unique. This flexibility contrasts sharply with Windows, where interface changes are often imposed with major updates, leaving users frustrated and disoriented. Here, control remains with the user, not the vendor. Updates, a constant source of irritation for Windows users, are handled with a level of respect that feels almost revolutionary. Instead of sudden restarts, forced update windows, or feature changes that disrupt established workflows, this Linux distro allows users to update on their own schedule. Updates are incremental, predictable, and reversible if something goes wrong. This reliability is particularly attractive to professionals who depend on their machines for work and cannot afford unexpected downtime. From an economic perspective, the implications are significant. Windows licenses add to the cost of new computers, and subscription models continue to expand. This Linux distro is free, not in the sense of cheap, but in the sense of freedom. Users are not locked into a vendor's ecosystem, forced to accept terms they don't agree with, or pressured into upgrading hardware to meet artificial requirements. For schools, small businesses, and developing regions, this can be transformative. It lowers the barrier to entry for modern computing and reduces long-term costs. Corporate and institutional adoption is another factor that could accelerate Windows' decline. As organizations reassess their dependence on proprietary software, many are exploring open-source alternatives to reduce costs and increase control. This Linux distro offers enterprise-grade stability with consumer-friendly usability, making it a viable option not just for IT departments, but for end users as well. Once employees become comfortable with it at work, the idea of using it at home no longer feels strange. The community behind this distro also plays a crucial role. Unlike proprietary systems driven primarily by shareholder interests, this project thrives on collaboration between developers, designers, and users. Bugs are reported and fixed in the open. Features are discussed publicly. This transparency fosters a sense of shared ownership that is difficult to replicate in closed ecosystems. Users are not just customers. They are participants in the evolution of the platform. Another subtle but important factor is how this Linux distro aligns with broader trends in computing. As more applications move to the web, the underlying operating system becomes less about running specific programs and more about providing a secure, efficient environment for accessing services. Linux excels in this role. Browsers perform just as well, if not better, and web-based tools run identically across platforms. In this context, Windows' historical advantage of exclusive desktop software becomes less relevant with each passing year. By 2026, the cumulative effect of all these factors could reach a tipping point. Users who once stuck with Windows out of habit begin to question that choice. New computer buyers, especially younger users who grew up with smartphones and tablets, are less attached to any particular desktop operating system. When they encounter a Linux distro that just works, respects their privacy, performs better on their hardware, and costs nothing, the rationale for choosing Windows weakens considerably. This doesn't mean Windows disappears overnight. Legacy systems, specialized software, and entrenched workflows ensure it remains relevant for years to come. But obsolescence doesn't require extinction. It simply means no longer being the default choice. If this Linux distro continues to mature at its current pace, 2026 could be the year when choosing Windows feels like an exception rather than the norm. Ultimately, what makes this Linux distro so disruptive is not a single breakthrough feature, but a holistic approach to computing that prioritizes users over vendors, efficiency over bloat, and freedom over control. It takes lessons learned from decades of Linux development and packages them in a form that anyone can use. In doing so, it challenges the assumption that Windows is the inevitable choice for desktop computing. And once that assumption is gone, the door is open for a future where Linux is no longer the alternative, but the standard.